Bongbong, governor of the family's home province, is the man in the flashing bow tie. There was food and dancing and live music, including the revelers' version of a song that last year was a rallying cry to feed the poor. This version is memorable for its enthusiasm. Memorable, too, because the former First Family and their friends didn't realize how hungry their own people were. Hungry for political change at the very least. The palace tapes CBS News gained access to are but a fraction of the library and the legacy Ferdinand Marcos left behind.
That was a CBS News story from 1986 showing the Marcoses on the eve of their fall from power. This month we remember that fall and the story of the hundreds of thousands who risked their lives to make that fall happen. But we overlook how improbable that fall actually was. Tonight, why the Marcoses lost. It wasn't necessarily meant to be. What the great dictator had going for himself and why it turned out not to be enough is our topic for tonight. I'm Manolo Quezon, the Explainer. President Ferdinand E. Marcos once said, "Never make an important decision when you're angry, hungry, or happy." In 1969, he became only the second president to be re-elected to office by playing it cool and playing to win at all costs. His opponent was Sergio Osmeño Jr. of the Liberal Party. Marcos defeated him by waging war on many fronts. First, he attacked Osmeño's record as a businessman during the Japanese occupation, contrasting it with his guerrilla record. Second, he fostered divisions within the Liberal Party itself, the so-called Marcos Liberals. And then the nationalista slate Marcos headed was also awash with cash, had a vast network of well-funded local officials, and had the entire national bureaucracy mobilized to support the incumbent's candidacy, and had further entrenched loyalists within the constabulary and the AFP. So as Sergio Osmeño famously put it to the press, "I was robbed." He was also quoted as having said, "I was outgunned, outgooned, and outgoaled by the mighty Marcos machine." Yet, as we saw on the show last week, after spending mightily enough to cause devaluation and inflation, the Marcos landslide of 1969 dissipated quickly. By 1971, the Marcos, mobbed by an adoring public, was now isolated from the public and would remain increasingly remote as time went on. Marcos was thus, in a way, stuck. He had moved heaven and earth to become only the second president re-elected by the people, but his sinking popularity was at odds with his continuing ambition to stay in office. His attempts to change the constitution got bogged down in scandals involving allegations of bribery. In the end, he decided to tear up the constitution, frighten the courts, padlock Congress, arrest his enemies, and silence the media. To do this, he relied on the military, whose leadership he selected from his UP Vanguard cronies. The man in gold braid in this photo, for example, will become increasingly central to his maintaining military control. Now, that man was General Fabian Ver, Marcos's relative, and was in charge of the Presidential Security Group and military intelligence during the martial law years. In 1981, Ver replaced General Romeo Espino as Chief of Staff of the AFP. Now, while Marcos had begun to restore the outward appearances of the three branches of government in 1978 with the interim Batasan Pambansa, real power was still in his own hands and a few trusted subordinates. Since 1972, the man in charge of the department, later Ministry of National Defense, was Juan Ponce Enrile. And it was Enrile who was the ultimate civilian authority on all decisions, including whom to arrest, whom to parole, who to put on trial. Unyielding opponents like Ninoy Aquino stayed in jail, while lesser-known critics of the government were gunned down or tortured. Now, in those new society years, Marcos kept everyone in check by playing them off against each other. He refused to designate a successor, which kept everyone guessing and plotting, and he knew everything about anything by means of spies and surveillance. Now, the media remained tightly controlled, local officials were watched by the military, and the judiciary continued to be under his thumb. In 1981, Marcos arranged to have a presidential election that was such a sham, the opposition boycotted it, and to have a token opponent, he had to temporarily revive the dormant Nacionalista Party to find someone to defeat. George Bush Sr. went to Manila and said Washington loved FM's dedication to democracy. In a strange echo of 1969, within 2 years of his 1981 re-election, Marcos was again on the ropes. The economy had tanked and Marcos's health took a turn for the worse. Ninoy Aquino came home to convince Marcos to step down and was gunned down as he stepped down from the plane. The ultimate trump card of Marcos, both in his own eyes and those of his critics, was Washington, who viewed him as indispensable. Yet as public opinion at home and abroad turned against Marcos, Washington started to make noises about his needing to moderate his greed. In 1985, Marcos decided to shut up Washington and his critics by calling for early or snap elections. It may be that Marcos believed he had enough popularity to defeat Salvador H. Laurel, whom he expected anyway to wage a symbolic, gentlemanly campaign. But Laurel gave way to Cory Aquino. Now, aside from offending Marcos's machismo, Cory proved to be the kind of opponent difficult to attack. She was the widow of a martyr and personally so different from Marcos that he couldn't fight her pound for pound in the kind of political boxing he'd mastered. He was an orator. She droned on in speeches. He had a kind of faded charisma. Hers was derived from her cause and not herself. He had money. She made a virtue of running a chaotic ragtag campaign. Marcos compared himself to an old war horse smelling the gunpowder of battle, but he was tired and sick. His wife had to do a lot of his campaigning for him. And the money poured and the machinery kicked in, but for some reason the money didn't get where it was supposed to, and the machinery, while massive, was unable to attract genuine enthusiasm. On February 5, 1986, Jaime Cardinal Sin warned that Catholics would employ civil disobedience measures if the election proved fraudulent. On February 7th, the snap election was held, and the Commission on Elections claimed Ferdinand Marcos was leading, while the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, or NAMFREL, reported that Corazon Aquino was winning. She proclaimed victory on February 8th. Now, incidentally, NAMFREL is now being denied accreditation by COMELEC for the 2010 elections. Anyway, the next day, February 9th, the COMELEC's attempt to computerize the canvassing of votes blew up. Linda Kapunan, shown in this post-EDSA photo, led the walkout of computer tabulators in protest over being instructed to cheat. The COMELEC computer operator sought sanctuary in Baclaran Church, and by February 13th, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines issued an unprecedented pastoral letter condemning election fraud, essentially withdrawing the mandate of heaven from Marcos. On February 15th, the Batasan Pambansa in stormy session went ahead and proclaimed Marcos and Tolentino as President and Vice President-elect respectively. So far, so good. What was expected to happen took place. And yet on February 16th, the Tagumpay ng Bayan took place when Cory Aquino led a mammoth rally of, some say, more than 2 million people at Luneta, where she launched a nationwide civil disobedience campaign and the boycott of Marcos' crony firms to force him to concede defeat. People gave up beer and ice cream and stopped paying their electric bills. Now, at this point, it was still so far so good for Marcos. Government remained firmly in his hands. Even if there were divisions within his government, he was still on top of the situation. He even discovered a plot by Juan Ponce Enrile to attack the palace on February 23rd and hold him hostage. Marcos promptly ordered Enrile's arrest. On February 22nd, hearing they were about to be rounded up, Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and Lieutenant General Fidel V. Ramos revolted against Marcos and holed themselves up in Camp Aguinaldo. And this is where Marcos, as having mastered the game, proved his undoing. On one hand, Marcos had a former ROTC officer, Ver, in charge of his military, while the rebel armed forces had leadership from a West Point graduate, another Marcos cousin, Fidel Ramos. And while Marcos had the powers of a commander-in-chief and the entire national treasury at his beck and call, he now had the church militant conferring a kind